Yeah, I was wondering what to do this week in the sense that I kind of felt like we've come to the end of part one somehow. So for the last, I don't know how many weeks it is now, it's quite a few weeks, isn't it? 7 or 8 weeks, I'm not sure exactly. We've been looking at different ideas, different interpretations, doing a bit of practice, but the word Eco-Dharma suggests, and I think, it's just been said that it is, some kind of combination of spiritual practice and environmental activism, shall we say. So I wanted to move it on to that sense of this isn't just about thinking about discussing something or doing some nice spiritual practices together, but it's also about the nature of the subject matter of what's happening to the ecosystem is that we need to do something about it. We collectively, human beings, need to start acting differently. There's work to be done, very, very huge, crucially important work needing to be done. But then one of the main reasons why we have this problem is a kind of mentality of work. Work is all important. We have to work. We have to do, and we've forgotten how to be. So this is being said many, many times by many, many people. Within a lot of the environmental movement, that kind of mentality of work is unashamedly, this is what people feel they need to be and to do. And there isn't anything wrong with that, I don't think. That we've got to build lots of, solar arrays and windmills, and we've got to, campaign against the oil companies and the governments and et cetera, et cetera. That's all fine. I support all of that. Thousands of different things. That's a huge amount of work, busy work that needs to be done. But it's interesting, Thich Nhat Hanh was very eloquent on this point, was he not? That those kind of solutions, if you like, the physical work that needs to be done is not enough in itself. And in a sense, not that it's exactly less important, but it doesn't get to the heart of the problem, because as he said, it doesn't actually address the root causes of the problem. And this is where I think Dharma comes in very importantly, very significantly. The Buddha, perhaps more clearly than any other teacher, the great teachers in history, has conveyed the fact that the cause of our problems, which we invariably tend to place outside ourselves, we think it's somebody else, something else, it's a system, it's the government, it's the corporations that are doing the damage to the planet. So some kind of external force like this is the cause of the problem. Or the solution, is to build this or that, or to, do this or that. The cause of the problem, though, the Buddha said, is in the mind. And in a way, I think, it's probably true that the way that he conveyed that message, which was how it needed to be expressed at the time, was to a great extent in terms of the situation of the individual person. Yeah. So each of us individually tends to view our own suffering as being a product of external factors. But if we inquire more deeply and more deeply and more deeply still, ultimately we realize all of our problems, all of the problems that we experience, in fact, the root causes within our own mind. And then a very significant change takes place when we really understand that deeply. For one thing, we can just stop complaining. Nothing to complain about, if that's the case, is there? Nothing at all. Whatever we complain about, we realize is a problem because of the way that our mind is responding to it. Whatever external circumstance we're upset about. We're upset about it because of the way our mind is reacting to it. So this problem of environmental destruction, now this is, I think, now the situation in the world is very different from what it was in the Buddha's time. And so now I think that it's very important to look at the root cause and the nature of the problem, not so much in terms of the individual and the individual's mind, but in terms of the collective mind of humanity, if you like. Okay. It's our collective behavior that is the problem. And that collective behavior comes from a collective mindset. So I can't solve this problem by working on myself in isolation. So the element of understanding myself and my own part in the solution to the problem, the element of realizing that I am not a separate individual in a sense. I'm not separate, I am connected as part of a larger whole. And it is only in the, I would say, actual experience of that reality, not just as an intellectual concept, but in moments when I directly experience that to be the case, is when I begin to feel that I have some agency, some power in this. So if I'm experiencing myself as a separate individual, I'm bound to feel very, very powerless. And I can compensate for that in various ways by kind of creating some kind of illusion of individual power. Like I can become a politician, I can become the president of the United States. And then I think I have some real power. I have power over the situation. I can control what's happening in the world. Well, of course, that's not the case. In a position like that, yes, there are certain things you can do, you can have quite sort of big impact, but you can't just make the world be the way you want it to be. And a lot of the things that you do have some individual personal power like that, in that way, are very destructive. So, seeking a political position of power or wealth that will give you similar power, etc. That kind of power is, I think, that it's a compensating mechanism that comes from a sense of powerlessness that people feel. And that powerlessness is a very, very widespread feeling. As those who are most sort of damaged by it, I think, who need to compensate in this way, they may have, I don't know, I'm just speculating, but I suspect that commonly it's because those individuals have suffered you know, very negative experiences in early childhood that they have to compensate by this lust, striving for power over the world. But we do have power of another kind if we can free ourselves from that prison of the separate self. So, you know, we've looked quite a bit in the meditations and in the talks about how we can connect in a group like this, or, you know, many, many other groups like this, we're meeting together or meeting online like this, we can experience being part of something bigger, part of a bigger, a larger mind, actually, you know, the collective mind of the group, that our consciousness is not separate. And that experience, it can be varying degrees of intensity. You know, sometimes it can be very intense. We feel really strongly connected, feel part of something. And I've had this experience many times. And more probably, I think more in this kind of group where there is a shared, you know, commitment to both the spiritual side of things and also the activist side of things, if you like. In fact, I was thinking I might call this particular talk, you know, spiritual activism. What is that? And there's a book by that title, which some of you might know, by Alistair McIntosh. He's a quite an inspirational figure. He's a Scottish environmental activist, a Quaker. He taught an MA program on spiritual activism at the University of Strathclyde. And Matt Carmichael, who is a close friend of mine who worked with me on Schumacher North for many years, he's co-written a book with Alistair McIntosh of that title, Spiritual Activism, based on that. The spiritual activism, okay. And in the meditation, I tried to kind of emphasize this can take many, many forms. So Eco-Dharma, I would say, if it's going to be worth the name, is a form of spiritual activism. It's not just meditating about the environment, the ecological situation. That's part of it. But it is also, I think it's meaningless unless there's some kind of real heart commitment to doing something about this situation. So as I said in the talk, doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to go and, you know, plant loads of trees or put solar panels on a roof, whatever. Those things are good to do, and if we can do them, if we have opportunity to do them, we should do them. And the same in the political protests, or writing to your MP, or lying down in the road in front of the bulldozers, whatever, you know, form you find, you know, you feel yourself called to do. It's also important. I don't think that everybody has to be involved in political action. I think everybody should be involved in some kind of practical things, you know, if it's like eating less meat, you know, changing your diet to make it more environmentally friendly, changing your purchasing habits and so on. I think these are kind of civic duties, actually. And they are very significant actions, actually, they can be. But there are many other ways that we can be active. And so each of us has our own individual disposition and way of doing things. Yeah. I mean, I kind of feel like I'm still talking to the York Buddhist group because there's nobody else here. But you know, officially, this weekly meeting is now the kind of weekly forum for the Jamyang Eco-Dharma group, and so as that group, well, we have already, you know, and we're already kind of signed up for a very practical initiative of tree planting, as I'm sure you're all aware. And we will do more, and we're having 2 meetings. Well, then, we're having the monthly meeting starting next week, and we're having a bigger event on the 20th of June, and there'll be more events of this kind, which will be a combination of, there'll be meditation and perhaps spiritual talks at different times, but also there will be discussion of practical things we can do. We'll make plans. So I'm very excited about this, actually, because I feel like this Eco-Dharma, it's not just a kind of buzzword, I think it's much more than that. And interestingly, so I'm now coming towards the end of a 7-week course, which I've mentioned before, I think, and we've come across this term deep adaptation. So I'm doing this on a Wednesday night. And so there's 35 or so people on that course. Now, the idea of deep adaptation doesn't contain any reference to spirituality, particularly. It's about, the ecological crisis is, perhaps even more serious than we had been thinking. Let's face up to that fact. Let's face up to the reality of just how urgent and critical this situation is. It's an emergency. It's a global emergency, and it may already be too late. Okay, nothing in there about spirituality. But so far, all of the people that I've connected with, a number of people, seems to me that all of them are practicing, not necessarily under the name of Buddhism. Many of them, are using Buddhist practices, some other practices which are really the same, but just under a different name. So it's not just coincidental. It's not just that I think that there happens to be some people who have an interest in both. It's that there's a very fundamental connection between them, between a certain kind of motivation to act, to do something about the situation, and a spiritual motivation which leads people into meditation, Buddhism in particular. And I think it's the combination of the two that is the only solution. And this is, the message of Thich Nhat Hanh's talk, is we need to both do and be. We need to, we need to engage with spiritual practice. We need to learn to be present in the moment. We need to practice mindfulness, mindful awareness, and we need to adopt the way of living that grows out of that mindful awareness. So with mindful awareness, we will not want to eat meat when we understand what is happening to the animals whose meat we are eating. Simply doesn't make any sense. So clearly, the vast majority of people are unreflectively eating meat that they buy from supermarkets. Not just, meat that they very carefully checked out to make sure that the animals are having a good life, but just go to the supermarket and buy any old, meat that's there. When those animals are being tortured and imprisoned, and their suffering is inconceivable, and it's also destroying the planetary ecosystem, those people cannot be fully awake. Well, that sounds very kind of judgmental. It's not meant to be judgmental. It's kind of, it seems clear that we're not going to solve this problem unless we collectively wake up. And also, I'm going to, be probably sound equally judgmental now about some Buddhists. I think, many Buddhists that I know who happily you know, their practice, very, very kind of dedicated to their Buddhist practice, but not tuned into the environmental issues. And a particularly, you know, a good friend of mine, Elaine Brook, who was actually the person who inspired me to start the Jamyang Center in Leeds, because she started a center, a Buddhist center, a FPMT center in her own home in Herefordshire, and also had started an environmental network there. So she inspired me to do both things in Leeds, actually. First, I started the Buddhist center, and then I started the environmental network. And she actually, you know, was quite heartfelt. She would talk about it. That she, so many people dedicated to Buddhism, she just could not arouse any interest in this environmental activism, which for her was a passion. So curious. There must be some kind of blind spot, I think. Anyway, it wasn't quite exactly what I wanted to be talking about. So what I want to talk about particularly today is, as I say, we've explored the ideas and done some practice together. And it may well have inspired some of you to take some action, I don't know, or think about it at least. But now I want to move on from that to really reflecting more closely on, okay, what do we do? What do each of us do? What do we do as a group here and now? Whether it be in terms of meditation practice, perhaps, or other activities that we're involved in, or communicating these ideas to other people, other groups, or growing our own vegetables, or changing our diet, you know, getting involved in different activities. So many tens, hundreds of thousands, millions of environmental ecological projects that are going on, that, you know, from tiny to enormous. There's absolutely must be ways that each of you and each of us could connect with some of those. So I wanted to just begin that exploration today. And in the meditation, one thing that I particularly wanted to bring out was, and actually I'm coming back to somewhere I got led away from at the beginning of the talk. I want to come back to this point about the sense of empowerment, the sense of power that comes from this connection. And I said, you know, we can get that from meditating in a group online like this or whatever, you know, Thomas Hubel talks very eloquently about it. Actually, the most powerful experiences I've had of that kind of connection have been in groups that are mainly focused on the, not always environmental setting. You know, in earlier times in my life, it was the nuclear threat. That was seen as a problem, or economic injustice. That was seen as a problem. But that kind of deep commitment to trying to do something about those issues, where something has gone terribly wrong, and we feel it needs to be changed, and we individually feel very, very powerless. So my activist sort of career, if you like, was really born in 1980, when the threat of nuclear war was hanging over our heads, in a terrifying fashion, and people were feeling very, very powerless. Many people were feeling very, very powerless individually. But many, many times I've experienced when in a large group that is collectively committed to doing something, that sense of powerlessness disappears. So it is the consciousness of myself as an isolated individual that makes me feel powerless. And the consciousness of being at one with an open-ended, open-textured, group of people. It's not really a group. I mean, so I might be in a demonstration in Trafalgar Square or outside the gates of the nuclear missile base where we often used to go. So there might be 100 or 200 other people there, or 1,000 people, or whatever. But of course, the connection goes much wider than that. In those moments, I remember particularly 10,000 of us marched through the center of Brussels, where the NATO headquarters, we marched past the NATO headquarters, and there were helicopters flying over our heads. And the sense that we were part of a global community, that we were completely connected with all of the other. There were millions of people in that movement, millions of people. So you don't feel powerless. You know that this movement that you are part of has power. And this ecological movement that is happening worldwide is, it is possibly the largest, what is it? Yeah, Paul Hawken calls it the largest social movement in history. He's talking more widely about the ecological and peace and social justice movement and so on. But really, it is gathering around the issue of climate change and environmental destruction and mass extinction. And in that, when you actually experience that connection, as opposed to just thinking about it, that feeling of, oh, I can't do anything, I'm too small, just dissolves and disappears, because the boundaries of the isolated self have dissolved. So, yeah, this is what the Buddha was talking about, emptiness, isn't it? We suffer because we experience ourselves as Albert Einstein actually said, the individual experiences himself, his thoughts and actions, as somehow separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness, Einstein called it. And that is, the Buddha said, this is the cause of our suffering. Fundamental ignorance, in one way of understanding it, simply is this sense, this feeling, this unspoken belief or unconscious mindset that says, I am separate from the rest of reality. I'm separate from everybody else. That is, if that were true, then that sense of powerlessness would have some foundation. But it isn't true. That's not the reality. We exist as knots in the web of life, if you like. The Indra's net. Each individual is a knot or a node in the net, a point in this vast interconnected web. It's one thing. My consciousness, my awareness, is an aspect of a much bigger awareness. Buddhism is called the Dharmakaya, the omniscient mind. The one mind in Zen is referred to. So that one mind, that infinite mind that our own mind is part of knows exactly what it is that this particular node, this particular, element within the web should be doing. So if I can tune into that bigger consciousness, then that anxiety, well, what can I do? What should I do? I can't do enough. I don't know what to do. It kind of disappears. And action just flows from that awareness. So the deeper we can go in our spiritual practice into the well of stillness, mindful awareness, presence, then we increasingly know intuitively what it is we have to do. And often there isn't anything that we need to do other than be still and listen and wait for the call. And sometimes the call will come and we know that we need to do something. We need to kind of get busy. So I don't know, I hope that I've made some helpful connections there. But what I wanted to talk about was, okay, so we're here because we understand that this is important and that there's a need to do something. And how do we tune into knowing what it is we should be doing? So just wanted to kind of open that up, and perhaps we'll continue to explore that. But yeah, be interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you.